From 1787 to 1823, wealthy families across colonial America quietly sent their most troublesome sons to a secluded religious institution deep in Virginia, St. Augustine Seminary. They were told it was a place for spiritual correction and religious education, a final chance to reform young men who had become liabilities to their powerful dynasties. But none of those boys ever came home. Church records show 247 students enrolled during the seminary's 36-year operation. Not one ever graduated as an ordained priest. Not one returned to their families. Their disappearances became whispers, rumors swept aside by those with too much to lose. The mystery endured for over a century, until 1998, when renovation workers stumbled upon a hidden chamber beneath the crumbling foundation. Inside, they found sealed documents, journals, and letters, evidence that shattered the myth. St. Augustine Seminary was never a place of salvation. It was a prison, a blackmail engine, and a front for one of the most calculated criminal enterprises in colonial history. Few dare to talk about what truly happened, because the Sterling family, the architects of this deception, still hold influence in quiet but powerful corners of American society. Before we continue the chilling story of Father Edmund Sterling and his unholy institution, don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell. This is content for true mystery seekers. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? _ Chapter 1, A Dangerous Inheritance. Colonial Virginia in 1787 was a land of wealth, power, and silence. Vast plantations thrived on the backs of enslaved labor. Families grew fortunes through tobacco and trade, and protected their secrets with ruthless efficiency. In the heart of the Tidewater region, where rivers cut through thick forests and isolated estates, the Sterling family had become untouchable. They were pillars of both commerce and faith, admired and feared in equal measure. Edmund Sterling, born in 1751, was the third son of a tobacco baron whose fortune was built on quietly criminal foundations. Unlike his brothers, Edmund had no interest in plantations or trade. What he inherited was more dangerous than land or gold, an uncanny understanding of human weakness, and a gift for exploiting it. When he announced plans to open a Catholic seminary in staunchly Protestant Virginia, his family was embarrassed. They thought it was religious fervor or madness. They were wrong. In 1786, St. Augustine Seminary was constructed on 340 acres of dense woodland in Henrico County, just far enough from Richmond to ensure isolation. Gothic stone buildings, imported European craftsmen, and an expansive library gave the illusion of legitimacy. But the staff Edmund gathered were men with dark pasts, loyal only to him. He called himself Father Sterling, and he promised Virginia's elite families something they desperately needed, a place to send sons who had become too curious, too rebellious, too informed. _ Chapter 2, Secrets for Sale. The first class arrived in spring of 1787, 12 young men, aged 16 to 23. Their families paid £50 each, enough to build a house at the time, and pledged more to support their son's spiritual development. What they didn't realize was that Father Sterling never intended to train priests. He intended to mine these boys for information, family secrets, criminal records, evidence of infidelity, slavery abuses, or financial fraud. Then he would quietly extort the parents, under threat of exposure. Each boy became a bargaining chip. Each silence, a revenue stream. By autumn of 1789, cracks began to show. The Whitmore family, powerful traders from Charleston, had sent their eldest son Jonathan to St. Augustine after he questioned discrepancies in their shipping records, records that hinted the family cargo included more than just rice and tobacco. When October passed with no letter home, the Whitmores grew uneasy. They sent a trusted overseer to investigate. He never returned. Thomas Hartwell's visit to St. Augustine. Thomas Hartwell had been dispatched to check on young Jonathan Whitmore's progress. But what he found at St. Augustine defied all explanation. At first glance, the seminary appeared perfectly normal. Evening prayers drifted from the chapel in solemn tones, lights glowed warmly in the study hall windows, the day's routine played out with the calm order of a religious institution. But when Hartwell asked to see Jonathan specifically, Father Sterling's response raised quiet alarm. The young man, Sterling explained, was in deep spiritual retreat. He had experienced a profound religious awakening, so profound, in fact, that it required complete isolation from worldly concerns, including contact with family. Hartwell, a man who had spent over 30 years managing the Whitmore family's more delicate affairs, recognized evasion when he heard it. Calmly, he insisted on at least catching a glimpse of Jonathan, to assure the family of the boy's well-being. Father Sterling agreed, but with an odd condition. Hartwell could observe from the back of the chapel, in shadow, and under no circumstances was he to make contact. That evening, as twilight deepened around the ancient stone walls of St. Augustine, Hartwell slipped quietly into a rear alcove of the chapel. What he witnessed there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The young men filed into their pews with airy uniformity, their faces blank and serene, like statues responding to some internal command. They recited the liturgy in perfect, lifeless unison. Not one glance strayed toward the visitors' section. Not one showed the small signs of individuality, fidgeting, whispers, nervous glances, that one might expect in a hall full of confined youth. But most disturbing of all, Hartwell counted only 19 students. Father Sterling had claimed there were 37 enrolled. Among those 19, Hartwell thought he recognized Jonathan Whitmore. But the spirited, rebellious heir who had once stormed out of Charleston now sat rigid, eyes glassy with devotion, a tranquil stranger who looked as if he had forgotten his own name. Hartwell returned to Charleston with a heavy heart and relayed everything to the Whitmore family. They faced an impossible choice. Their son was, apparently, alive and under spiritual care, exactly what they had asked for. Yet something essential had shifted. He was no longer quite himself. And bringing him home might mean answering questions about why he had been sent away in the first place. In the end, as Father Sterling no doubt expected, the Whitmores chose silence. They continued their payments to St. Augustine Seminary, reassuring themselves, and their social circles, that Jonathan had found his true calling in religious life. It was easier than confronting the alternative, that they had delivered their firstborn son into the hands of something far worse than the scandal they had tried so hard to suppress. Over the following months, similar scenes played out across Virginia's elite households. Sons who had been sent to St. Augustine for spiritual correction began sending letters home. The letters were curiously uniform, each filled with dutiful expressions of devotion, gratitude, and peace. To the untrained eye, they might have seemed like signs of progress. But to attentive parents, something felt off. When visits were arranged, rare and strictly supervised, families found their sons changed. Not outwardly harmed, but altered in a way that defied explanation. They were quieter, more obedient. Their eyes held a stillness that was unsettling. They no longer questioned their surroundings, nor did they speak of coming home. They were, disturbingly, at peace. No one spoke openly of their concerns. The reasons their sons had been sent to the seminary were too shameful to admit. Better to accept the illusion of rehabilitation than risk the damage of exposure. Father Sterling depended on that silence. He cultivated it with the same precision he applied to raising his fees, justifying each increase as necessary for their sons' continued spiritual development. As the 1790s progressed, St. Augustine's reputation grew, but only in whispers, behind closed doors, through coded recommendations passed between drawing rooms and clubs. It had become something unprecedented in colonial society, a discreet solution for families with sons too inquisitive, too rebellious, or simply too dangerous to remain at home. The Randolphs enrolled their youngest after he uncovered the family's hidden ties to illegal slave trading. The Carters sent their heir apparent when he began asking about tenant farmers who had mysteriously disappeared from their Rappahannock plantations. The Byrds delivered their son in haste after he witnessed a midnight meeting that connected his father to a string of suspicious accidents among business rivals. What none of them realized was that Father Sterling kept meticulous records, painstakingly compiled dossiers that chronicled every scandal, every whispered secret that led to enrollment. In the tower room of the seminary, behind a locked door, his study held rows of files detailing each family's vulnerabilities, names, dates, locations, and testimonies, often provided, unwittingly, by the students themselves during confessional spiritual counseling. The transformation of these boys was slow and deliberate. New arrivals were given comfortable rooms and greeted with apparent kindness. Classes were held daily, real theological discussions led by Father Sterling, whose knowledge of Scripture was surprisingly deep despite his shadowy past. Meals were excellent. The library was extensive. The structure of the day was rigid but not yet oppressive. But after a few weeks, the shift would begin. Students wrote home about feeling exhausted, blaming the demanding schedule. Their handwriting changed, becoming more uniform, almost mechanical. Their letters shortened. Personality drained from the page. Instead, each message praised their parents' decision to send them. They spoke of inner peace, of purpose, of grace. None of them mentioned the dreams. None of them remembered what happened in the chapel after dark. What the students didn't know was that their evening wine was being carefully laced with measured doses of laudanum and other opiates, quietly procured through medical connections. The doses were calculated with precision, just enough to cultivate dependency and docility, yet subtle enough to avoid obvious signs of drug use. Combined with strict isolation from outside contact and constant reminders of their family's disappointment, the chemical influence transformed these young men. Over time, they became increasingly compliant, their capacity for independent thought steadily eroded. By 1793, Father Sterling had refined this system to near perfection. He could now predict, with chilling accuracy, how long it would take to break a new arrival's resistance and reshape him into the obedient son his family hoped to see during infrequent visits. The process typically took 4 to 8 months, depending on the student's personality and the weight of the secrets he carried. But Sterling's true genius wasn't merely in controlling the students, it was in manipulating their families. As months stretched into years, tuition fees rose sharply. What had begun as a modest £50 annual charge ballooned into hundreds, then thousands of pounds. The increases were justified under the guise of expanded spiritual programs and advanced theological training. But families were not just paying for education, they were paying for silence about the family secrets their sons had divulged during early spiritual counseling sessions. If a parent objected to the mounting fees or requested their son's return, Father Sterling would gently reference sensitive conversations the student had shared. These stories often included revelations about illegal business dealings, family scandals, or hidden crimes, details that, if made public, could devastate reputations and fortunes. The choice was never forced, but always clear: continue funding the boy's spiritual journey, or risk exposure of the family's most damning truths. Most chose to pay. By the winter of 1798, 11 years after St. Augustine Seminary's founding, Father Sterling's operation had become something far more insidious than mere extortion. He had quietly created what he referred to as the Virginia Arrangement, a web of blackmail schemes entangling nearly 24 of the colony's most influential families. The system operated with ruthless precision. Students who had remained at the seminary for years were gradually relocated from standard dormitories to private quarters carved into the limestone foundations of the building. These underground chambers were labeled advanced contemplative retreats. They were comfortable enough to deflect accusations of imprisonment, yet fortified well enough to prevent escape. Those students rarely appeared at public prayers. Their spiritual maturity, it was claimed, had transcended communal worship. Meanwhile, new students continued to arrive, keeping the seminary's outward appearance intact and providing a steady stream of fresh information, and fresh leverage. Father Sterling had developed a keen eye for identifying which boys held the most dangerous knowledge of their family's affairs. These were the ones whose spiritual retreats became indefinite. The case of Charles Randolph, who enrolled in 1796, offers a disturbing illustration of how far Stirling's methods had advanced. Charles had been sent to St. Augustine after uncovering that his father's tobacco exports were being used to launder profits from illegal slave trading ventures, activities that violated both Virginia statutes and federal maritime law. At first, Charles's letters home expressed the typical frustrations: rigid religious discipline, homesickness, and vague discontent. But as the months passed, his tone changed. His correspondent grew warmer, increasingly supportive of the very business practices he had once condemned. In fact, his final letters included enthusiastic endorsements of the family's trading partnerships. When Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Charles's younger brother, came to visit. By early 1799, the transformation of Charles was striking. Once troubled and morally resistant to the family's slave trading ties, he now spoke with practiced ease about agricultural cycles, shipping logistics, and the legal nuances of labor deployment. His former ethical objections had seemingly vanished, replaced by confident references to scripture that justified slavery through carefully curated theological interpretations. Visitors to St. Augustine Seminary were often impressed, but Thomas Jefferson Randolph was not so easily persuaded. Unlike others, he noticed small but troubling signs. Charles's pupils remained unnaturally dilated despite the midday sun. His hands trembled faintly when idle. Most haunting of all, when Thomas casually mentioned the name of their childhood dog, a companion both boys had cherished for years, Charles showed no flicker of recognition. Though he might have initially dismissed these concerns as byproducts of emotional strain or overwork, Thomas sensed something deeper was wrong. Rather than confront his family or Charles directly, he launched a quiet investigation into the seminary's operations. With access to an expansive network of shipping manifests, family correspondence, and merchant records, Thomas was uniquely positioned to connect dots that others had missed. His talent for scrutiny was inherited. His grandfather had kept exhaustive ledgers, and his father had always distrusted financial arrangements that were too tidy. Over the next several months, Thomas began to unravel a hidden web. He discovered that St. Augustine Seminary's tuition fees were disproportionately high, far exceeding the norm for even the most elite educational institutions. More curious still were recurring special donations from wealthy families, with no explanation of what services they secured. Shipping records revealed deliveries to the seminary that included a suspiciously high volume of medical supplies, pharmaceutical compounds, and materials more suited to penitentiary construction than classroom repair. And then came the most damning discovery. Thomas Jefferson Randolph began tracing the whereabouts of students who had either graduated from or left St. Augustine Seminary during its 11-year history. What he uncovered was deeply unsettling. While 247 young men had been officially enrolled, fewer than 24 could be found to have returned to their families or pursued careers elsewhere. The vast majority had simply vanished from public records following their time at the seminary. It was then that Thomas began to reconsider what had happened to his brother Charles. He no longer believed Charles was merely the victim of obscure religious indoctrination. Something far more sinister appeared to be at work. His investigation took a dangerous turn in the spring of 1799. Through contacts in his shipping business, Thomas learned he was not alone in his concerns. Several other families had quietly launched private inquiries into St. Augustine, reporting similar fears. Their sons' personalities had changed dramatically, and the seminary's financial demands kept growing. But, like Thomas, these families soon realized that probing into Father Stirling's institution risked exposing secrets they themselves had long buried. Each question about the seminary uncovered truths that many preferred to leave undiscovered. A breakthrough came when Thomas made contact with Martha Henley, the widow of a Williamsburg physician who had died under suspicious circumstances in 1797. Her late husband, Dr. Henley, had been one of the few doctors known to treat patients discreetly, asking no questions about unusual injuries or unexplained conditions among the wealthy elite. Among the belongings Martha inherited were his patient records, and significant debt. Within those files, Thomas found several entries related to St. Augustine Seminary. According to Dr. Henley's notes, Father Sterling had sought medical advice about the long-term effects of opiates on adolescent males. He specifically inquired about dosages that could foster dependency without causing visible physical deterioration. Between 1794 and 1796, Dr. Henley made multiple visits to the seminary, where he examined students who appeared to be suffering from long-term drug exposure. Yet they were being described as afflicted with spiritual melancholy, or even elevated states of religious ecstasy. Most disturbing of all were Dr. Henley's final entries on St. Augustine, dated just weeks before his unexpected death, officially ruled a heart attack. The physician's warning. The physician had begun expressing quiet but urgent concerns about the ethical implications of his consultations with Father Sterling. In his private notes, he recorded that several students he had examined were suffering from far more than spiritual afflictions. Some displayed signs of prolonged psychological trauma and even physical abuse. His final entry concerning the seminary was chillingly concise. The Sterling arrangement represents a fundamental violation of both medical ethics and human dignity. When Thomas Jefferson Randolph shared Dr. Henley's records with Martha, she revealed something disturbing. Her husband had been preparing to report his concerns about St. Augustine Seminary to the colonial authorities shortly before his sudden death. She had long suspected that his demise was connected to his mounting moral objections to Father Sterling's operations, but until now, she had lacked both the evidence and the social standing to act. Now armed with Henley's records, Thomas and Martha began to devise a strategy to expose the truth behind St. Augustine Seminary. But they faced severe constraints. A public scandal would not only shatter the seminary's reputation but also destroy the families of the boys imprisoned there, including Thomas's own. They needed a way to liberate the students without revealing the secrets that had led to their incarceration. Their plan was daring. Thomas would leverage his shipping business to orchestrate the accidental discovery of the seminary's illicit activities by colonial officials. Meanwhile, Martha would ensure that medical evidence of the students' mistreatment would be available to support legal action against Father Sterling. But just as they finalized their plan, they uncovered something far darker than either had imagined. The hidden files. While reviewing Dr. Henley's patient records one final time, Martha noticed a false bottom in his old medical bag. Inside was a bundle of documents that revealed the full scope of Father Sterling's operation. The seminary was not simply imprisoning troublesome sons or extorting wealthy families, it was systematically eliminating students who resisted chemical conditioning or retained knowledge that could threaten powerful interests. Among the documents were anatomical diagrams and disturbing medical notes. Dr. Henley had recorded what he called staged accidents, elaborate setups meant to disguise murders as suicides, illnesses, or divine punishment. The physician had apparently been coerced into using his medical expertise to cover up a series of calculated executions. One list detailed the names of 23 boys, exactly matching the number of death certificates issued over the seminary's 11-year history. But more horrifying was a second list, labeled, "Pending Resolution." It included the names of 12 current students. One name stood out. Charles Randolph. Thomas Jefferson Randolph was staggered. His younger brother wasn't just imprisoned, he was marked for death. _ If you've made it this far, take a moment to let that sink in. The horrors hidden in the hills of Virginia had only just begun to unfold. The reckoning begins. Determined to stop Father Sterling's murderous plan, Thomas and Martha raced to act. On the night of May 17, 1799, they approached St. Augustine Seminary under cover of darkness, armed with evidence and a desperate hope. What they found in the limestone chambers beneath the seminary would not only change the course of their lives, it would scar the survivors forever. And reveal something even more unthinkable. Father Sterling had been preparing for them all along. _ If this story sent chills down your spine, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support more content like this, and subscribe to uncover what happens next in this tale of human greed, corruption, and the fight for justice. The race to save Charles Randolph, and the other condemned students, had begun. But the true nightmare was only just beginning. The true extent of one of colonial America's most insidious criminal enterprises had finally come to light. Beneath the surface of St. Augustine Seminary, hidden far below its serene facade, lay not just holding cells for misbehaving students, but an entire underground complex. Among its chambers was a fully equipped medical facility, where Dr. Henley had long been coerced into participating in what Father Sterling chillingly referred to as spiritual interventions. Thomas had meticulously traced the pharmaceutical shipments to their origin. They weren't just being used to sedate the current population of students. They were also employed to stage convincing deaths, for those whose continued survival posed a risk to the operation. The case of Charles Randolph revealed just how far Sterling's system had gone. Charles had been found near death, heavily dosed with opiates and exhibiting symptoms of slow, systematic poisoning, carefully designed to resemble terminal consumption. According to medical charts Martha uncovered, he was expected to die of respiratory failure within the week. His family would receive the carefully constructed lie, a tragic death due to spiritual exhaustion and a frail constitution. But Charles was not the most harrowing discovery. In a locked section of the lowest basement, what appeared to be Father Sterling's private study, Thomas and Martha found a trove of documents that exposed the full scope of what they began calling the Virginia Arrangement. The files spanned over 12 years and detailed not only current students and their families but a sprawling network of influence stretching across colonial society. What had started as extortion of wealthy families had evolved into something far more dangerous. Father Sterling had used intelligence obtained from imprisoned students to manipulate everything from business deals to court rulings. The documents listed judges, merchants, landowners, and colonial officials, all unknowingly pulled into his web. There was evidence of slave trading violations, tax evasion, rigged land grants, and politically motivated prosecutions, all orchestrated through the information harvested at St. Augustine. Even more disturbing was evidence that Sterling had been selling secrets to British agents. St. Augustine had quietly become a center for espionage, a direct pipeline of intelligence from colonial elite families to British authorities. The tuition families paid was dwarfed by the payments Sterling received from British intelligence in exchange for compromising information about American leadership. But it was Sterling's personal letters that revealed the final horror. The seminary had been created with a larger goal, to weaken colonial society from within. It wasn't just about profit. It was about control. Father Sterling had operated as an embedded intelligence operative, and St. Augustine had been a covert British project, designed to manipulate and destabilize the colonies by compromising their most powerful families. The boys imprisoned below were not simply victims of family scandal or disciplinary cruelty. They were casualties in a shadow war between empires. When Thomas and Martha attempted to evacuate the surviving students, they discovered the final, terrifying safeguard. Father Sterling had anticipated such an event. The religious staff were, in fact, armed personnel with military training. The entire seminary had been constructed as a fortress, equipped with concealed armories, multiple security checkpoints, and escape routes. The confrontation was brutal. And in that chaos, the truth emerged fully. Father Sterling was not the religious zealot they had assumed, nor merely a criminal preying on the vulnerable. He was a highly placed operative, a man who had weaponized faith, fear, and family honor to build one of the most efficient intelligence networks in colonial America. As his men encircled Thomas, weapons drawn, Father Sterling stepped forward and said coldly, "You understand now, don't you? This was never about God. It was about control." Exposing this operation, Father Sterling said coldly, means destroying every family whose secrets we've documented. Your own family's slave trading violations alone would result in criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and a social disgrace that would haunt your descendants for generations. He gestured toward the files, thick folders containing damning documentation of the Randolph family's illegal dealings. Your brother Charles possesses detailed knowledge, shipping manifests, financial arrangements, business relationships, that could destroy not just your family, but dozens of others embedded in Virginia's commercial network. His continued existence represents an unacceptable risk to operations that serve the Crown's interest in maintaining colonial stability. Thomas Jefferson Randolph stood in silence, the weight of Sterling's words settling like iron chains around his conscience. This wasn't a simple threat. Sterling wasn't just aiming at individual families, he was holding hostage the very structure of Virginian society. Exposing the truth wouldn't just shame a few prominent names. It would tear apart the web of corruption that underpinned the entire colonial economy. This was no longer a question of saving his brother or protecting his family's name. It was a choice between preserving the fragile illusion of legitimacy, or revealing the systematic rot that sustained it. The choice is simple, Sterling continued. Allow us to complete our arrangements with the students currently in residence, and your family secrets, along with those of every other family, will remain protected. Interfere, and we will release the documentation that will annihilate the reputation and financial stability of Virginia's most powerful houses. But Thomas had spent months preparing for this moment. He had not come to St. Augustine Seminary alone. The resolution of the St. Augustine crisis required sacrifices that would reshape Virginia's political and social landscape for decades to come. Thomas's investigation had led him to a conclusion Father Sterling had never imagined. The only way to destroy the seminary's operation was to expose the very corruption it had been built to exploit and protect. Working with Martha Henley and a quiet coalition of colonial officials, men and women who had discovered their own families were compromised by Sterling's intelligence network, Thomas had crafted a daring strategy. They would sacrifice their social standing to save their children. And in doing so, they would cripple British intelligence operations in the colonies. On the morning of May 18, 1799, coordinated raids by colonial militia stormed St. Augustine Seminary. Father Sterling and his staff of British agents were arrested without a shot fired. Simultaneously, Thomas Jefferson Randolph and 17 other prominent Virginia families publicly confessed to their illegal business practices, political corruption, and social crimes, exposing the mechanisms that had made them vulnerable to Sterling's control. The fallout was seismic. Families who had ruled Virginian commerce and politics for generations now faced criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and social exile. The Randolph family's admission of slave trading violations triggered the largest criminal investigation in the colony's history, uncovering systemic breaches of both colonial and federal maritime law by dozens of elite households. But the plan worked. By voluntarily exposing their secrets, the families stripped Sterling of his leverage and dismantled the intelligence network at the heart of the seminary. The confessions were timed and crafted to deliver accountability, while shielding critical military and political intelligence from foreign eyes. Charles Randolph and 18 other students were rescued from the seminary's underground chambers. While their physical and psychological recovery would take years, they were free. And with their freedom, the facade of colonial innocence was forever shattered. Several of the survivors were left with permanent neurological damage, and all of them struggled with opiate dependency that required ongoing medical supervision. Charles never fully recovered his memories from the years before his enrollment at St. Augustine Seminary. He retained personality changes that left him compliant with his family's business interests, unable, or unwilling, to question their ethical implications. The investigation uncovered 23 bodies buried in unmarked graves on the seminary grounds, confirming that Father Sterling's operation had been systematically murdering students deemed too difficult to control or too knowledgeable to be allowed to live. Among the dead were sons of some of Virginia's most prominent families, young men whose mysterious deaths had been explained to their parents as the result of spiritual exhaustion, consumption, or other natural causes. Father Sterling himself vanished during the raid on St. Augustine. Despite extensive searches, neither he nor several of his key associates were ever found. Speculation abounded. Some believed they had escaped to British territory, others suspected they had been quietly extracted by their intelligence handlers. The uncertainty surrounding their fate persisted for decades, fueling fears that similar covert operations might be taking place elsewhere in the colonies. The exposure of the Virginia arrangement had repercussions far beyond the immediate victims. Revelations about the role of British intelligence in colonial society intensified distrust and resentment toward British authorities, accelerating political tensions that would ultimately lead to the War of 1812. Many of the families compromised by Sterling's operation became ardent supporters of American independence, determined to prevent future foreign manipulation of colonial life. In the short term, the scandal prompted sweeping reforms in Virginia's commercial and legal systems. New regulations were enacted to close the loopholes that had allowed Sterling's operation to flourish. Oversight committees were established to monitor religious and educational institutions that enrolled students from multiple families. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the St. Augustine scandal was its impact on how Virginia's elite raised their children. The tragedy revealed that family secrets could be weaponized, and that protecting children sometimes required confronting the very scandals parents had tried to bury. Thomas Jefferson Randolph never fully recovered from the realization that his family's wealth had been built on systematic criminality, and that his brother had been sacrificed to preserve it. Though Charles survived his imprisonment, the bond between the brothers was irreparably broken by the knowledge of what their family had been willing to do for the sake of appearances. The ruins of St. Augustine Seminary stood abandoned for nearly 50 years. Local residents claimed to hear strange noises and see flickering lights in the dilapidated buildings. When the property was finally purchased for development in 1847, construction workers discovered hidden underground chambers that had not been located during the initial investigation. Inside were documents suggesting that Sterling's operation had been far more extensive and organized than previously believed. The tragedy of St. Augustine serves as a haunting reminder. In the relentless pursuit of respectability and financial success, even the most sacred bonds, family, faith, and truth, can be corrupted. And when families are willing to sacrifice their own children to protect their secrets, no legacy is truly secure. They create vulnerabilities, openings that can be exploited by anyone who understands that desperation can make people capable of anything. But what do you think of this story? Do you believe the full truth about the Sterling family's operation has been revealed? Or could there be other secrets still buried in the hills of Virginia, waiting to be unearthed? Speech bubble emoji. Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale and want more chilling stories, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Because the darkness of human greed runs deeper than most can imagine. And only the bravest souls dare to explore its depths. See you in the next video, where we uncover yet another tale that reveals just how far people will go when money and reputation are on the line.